The ground trembles. 500 Scottish soldiers stand in two thin ranks across a low hillside above the port of Balaclava. Before them, emerging through the morning mist of the 25th October 1854, 4 squadrons of Russian cavalry, perhaps 2,000 horsemen, thunder down the slope at full gallop. Sabers glint. The earth shakes with the drumming of 8,000 hooves. Between these Highlanders and the British supply base at Balaclava harbor lies nothing but open ground. Traditional infantry doctrine demands a square formation 4 ranks deep, bristling with bayonets on all sides, an impenetrable fortress against cavalry. But there is no square here, just 2 lines of red-coated men, stretched dangerously thin across the hillside. There is no retreat from here. Men, their commander tells them, riding slowly along the line. You must die where you stand. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders do not waver. They do not form square. They stand in their exposed double line and wait for the Russian cavalry to come within range. What happens in the next moments will become legend captured by a journalist's pen as that thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. Yet the man who commands them, and the tactical audacity he displays, will fade into relative obscurity. This is the paradox of Colin Campbell, a soldier of humble origins who rose to Field Marshal, a tactical innovator who saved the Crimean supply line, a commander who later relieved Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny and held together British India when it hung by a thread. Yet, whilst the charge of the Light Brigade, a catastrophic blunder that occurred the same day, achieved immortality through Tennyson's verse, Campbell's disciplined stand has been overshadowed, his name less remembered than it deserves. The Battle of Balaclava witnessed both the most infamous disaster and one of the most remarkable defensive actions in Victorian military history. The disaster claimed the glory, but the defense, the thin red line, demonstrated something more valuable than romantic cavalry charges: the power of coolness under fire, tactical innovation, and absolute trust between a commander and his men. This is that story. Colin Campbell entered the world on the 20th October 1792 in Glasgow, Scotland. He was born Colin MacLiver, son to John MacLiver, a carpenter and cabinet maker, and Agnes Campbell. His mother died whilst he was still a boy, along with one of his twin sisters. His childhood in industrial Glasgow offered little promise of military glory. No estates, no connections, no purchased commissions. What it offered was hardship, and hardship would prove the making of him. His uncle, Major John Campbell, recognizing potential in the boy, took over his care and sent him to the Royal Military and Naval Academy at Gosport. At 15, young Colin secured an ensign's commission in the 9th Regiment of Foot. But here a curious transformation occurred. The boy was gazetted not as Colin MacLiver but as Colin Campbell. The romantic story, later invented by a journalist cousin during the Crimean War, claimed the Duke of York simply assumed the name. The truth was simpler and more deliberate. Colin changed his own name before commission, taking his mother's surname, perhaps seeking to honor her memory or distance himself from his carpenter father's trade. On the 26th May 1808, Ensign Colin Campbell joined his regiment. Within months, he stood on Portuguese soil under Sir Arthur Wellesley at the Battle of Vimeiro. He was 15 years old. The Peninsular War became Campbell's crucible. Whilst wealthier officers purchased promotions or enjoyed patronage, Campbell advanced through merit and blood. At the Battle of Barossa in March 1811, he took command of his regiment's flank companies when all senior officers fell wounded. At the Siege of San Sebastian in July 1813, he led the Forlorn Hope the first men over the breach, where casualties routinely exceeded 90%. He was wounded twice in that assault. At the Battle of the Bidassoa in October 1813, he received his third wound. These were not glorious injuries sustained in cavalry charges. Campbell led storming parties into fortified breaches where French defenders poured down musket fire grapeshot, and grenades. He learned warfare at its most brutal. Close combat in confined spaces where discipline and nerve mattered more than dash. He learned that men will follow officers who share their dangers. And he learned that survival in war requires both courage and calculation. After the Peninsular War ended, Campbell served in the disastrous Walcheren campaign, where disease killed more men than combat. He contracted malaria that would plague him for life. Posted to the Caribbean, he served in Barbados and Demerara, where he witnessed the brutal suppression of the slave rebellion of 1823. He sat on the court-martial that sentenced Reverend John Smith to death for allegedly inciting the revolt, a decision that would haunt later assessments of his character. By 1832, aged 40, Campbell was merely a major. 3 decades of service, multiple wounds, proven bravery, yet still he languished without significant command. The reason was simple. He lacked the money to purchase higher rank and the social connections to secure political patronage. The British Army's promotion system rewarded wealth over merit. Campbell had neither wealth nor influential family, but he had reputation. In 1835, he secured command of the 98th Regiment of Foot through exchange rather than purchase. He transformed this regiment through relentless training and personal attention to his soldiers' welfare. When the 98th deployed to China for the First Opium War in 1842, Campbell's care was such that the regiment lost not one man to disease during the long voyage, an unprecedented achievement when shipboard illness typically devastated troop transports. At the Battle of Qingqiang in July 1842, Campbell led his regiment in storming the Chinese fortifications. His tactical eye and personal courage impressed superiors. Finally, at age 50, he was noticed, promoted to colonel and appointed Companion of the Order of the Bath. He became Commandant of Hong Kong. Yet even success brought frustration. Posted to India in 1847 as a brigade commander, Campbell fought with distinction in the Second Anglo-Sikh War. At Chilianwala and Gujarat in 1849, he commanded divisions with skill. But when the Governor-General, Lord Dalhousie, ordered increasingly punitive expeditions against Pathan tribesmen campaigns, Campbell considered unjust and militarily unnecessary, he resigned his command in disgust. This decision reveals Campbell's character. Despite his ambition, despite decades of slow advancement, he would not participate in operations he deemed dishonorable. It was an expensive principle. He returned to England in 1853, aged 61, expecting his career had ended. Then the Crimean War erupted. In February 1854, Campbell accepted command of the Highland Brigade. British and French forces landed on the Crimean Peninsula to besiege the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The Highland Brigade, comprising the 42nd, 79th, and 93rd Regiments, would prove among the finest formations in the British Army. Campbell led them at the Battle of Alma on the 20th September 1854. His Highlanders stormed the Russian positions on the heights with such disciplined ferocity that Lord Raglan, the British commander-in-chief, gave Campbell permission to wear the Highland bonnet instead of the regulation cocked hat. It was an honor Campbell treasured. He had found his command, and they had found their general. At Alma, Campbell demonstrated the tactical principles he would perfect at Balaclava: careful reconnaissance, clear orders, personal example, and absolute refusal to waste his men's lives through reckless attacks. The Highlanders suffered casualties. Warfare demands its blood price, but they took their objectives with fewer losses than other brigades because their commander used terrain, timing, and fire, discipline, rather than simply throwing men forward in mass assaults. After Alma, the British Army settled into siege operations around Sevastopol. The Highland Brigade was detailed to guard the supply base at Balaclava Harbor 12 miles from the siege lines. Vulnerable and lightly defended, Campbell established his headquarters there with the 93rd Regiment. The other Highland regiments remained in the forward trenches. The Russians, seeking to break the siege, planned a major offensive to capture Balaclava. If successful, they would sever the British supply line and force the abandonment of the siege. The operation was scheduled for the 25th October 1854. Colin Campbell, now 61 years old, awaited them with 500 Highlanders and the tactical wisdom earned through 46 years of warfare. Everything he had learned, every probably sex wound, every hard-won promotion, every battle from Vimero to Alma would be tested in the next few hours. The strategic situation facing the British at Balaclava was precarious. The port sat at the southern end of a valley system flanked by heights on either side. The causeway heights to the north were fortified with a series of redoubts manned by Turkish troops. These redoubts contained British naval guns. Between the heights and Balaclava lay the port's immediate defenses. Campbell's 593rd Highlanders, 800 British cavalry, and a small force of Turkish infantry. General Pavel Liprandi commanded the Russian attack force, 25,000 infantry, 3,500 cavalry, and 76 guns. His objective was clear: seize the causeway heights, capture Balaclava, and cut the British lifeline. The Russian assault commenced at dawn on the 25th October. Artillery opened fire on the Turkish redoubts. Russian infantry advanced in massive columns. The Turkish defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, held briefly before abandoning their positions. The British naval guns fell into Russian hands. The causeway heights now belonged to the enemy. Lord Raglan, observing from the heights 2 miles away, ordered reinforcements forward from the siege lines, but they would require hours to arrive. For now, defense of Balaclava rested with the forces present. The cavalry divisions under Lord Lucan and the 93rd Highlanders under Campbell. As the Russian cavalry prepared to exploit their success, Campbell deployed his regiment on a low ridgeline between the village of Katakoy and Balaclava. Behind them lay the harbor packed with supplies, hospitals, and non-combatants. Before them lay open ground rising toward the causeway heights. There would be no reinforcements, no retreat, no margin for error. Campbell ordered his regiment into line 2 ranks deep, rather than the conventional square or 4-deep line. This was tactical audacity. Infantry squares had defended against cavalry for centuries, their 4-sided formation preventing horsemen from breaking through. But squares were defensive. They surrendered mobility and firepower. A 2-deep line maximized firepower whilst maintaining mobility, but it was desperately vulnerable to cavalry. If the line broke, horsemen would pour through and slaughter the scattered infantry. Why did Campbell choose this formation? The sources suggest multiple factors. The 93rd numbered only 550 men, insufficient to form an effective square. Campbell trusted his Highlanders' discipline absolutely. He had trained them, led them at Alma, knew they would not break. Moreover, he understood the Minié rifle with which they were armed. Its effective range far exceeded the old musket. 2 disciplined volleys from 500 rifles would devastate cavalry at ranges where traditional muskets would be ineffective. As the Russian cavalry, 4 squadrons strong, perhaps 2,000 horsemen, began their advance, Campbell rode slowly along the front of his line. Contemporary accounts record his words: "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." His aide, John Scott, replied, "Aye, Sir Colin. Needsby will do that." The Highlanders watched the Russian cavalry approach. No cheering, no bravado. Just grim professionals checking their rifles, fixing bayonets, waiting. Campbell ordered them to hold their fire. Russian horsemen came on at the trot, then the gallop. The ground shook. 500 Highlanders stood in their thin double line. At 300 yards, Campbell gave the order. The first volley crashed out. Russian horsemen tumbled, horses fell, but the main body came on. The 93rd reloaded with practiced efficiency, 12 well-drilled movements performed under fire whilst cavalry thundered toward them. The second volley fired at 200 yards. This time the Russian advance faltered, staggered, broke. Cavalry formations depend on momentum and cohesion. When horses begin to fall and riders to reel in their saddles, the charge disintegrates. The Russian cavalry wheeled away, seeking easier prey. They found none. The British Heavy Brigade, 800 horsemen under Brigadier General James Scarlett, countercharged uphill into 3,000 Russian cavalry, and, through sheer disciplined violence, sent them reeling back. William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent watching from nearby heights, wrote his famous description. The Russians dashed on towards that thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. In later accounts, he shortened this to thin red line, a phrase that entered military legend, but whilst Russell coined the phrase, Campbell created the reality. His decision to deploy in line rather than square was not desperation but calculated tactical innovation. He understood his soldiers, his weapons, and his enemy. The 93rd suffered minimal casualties, estimates suggest fewer than a dozen wounded. They had broken a cavalry charge that should have overwhelmed them, yet the day's drama was far from over. What happened next would overshadow Campbell's achievement and become the most famous military disaster in British history. Lord Raglan, still observing from the heights, saw Russian forces beginning to remove the captured British guns from the causeway. Heights. He sent an order to Lord Lucan, advance rapidly and prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. The order reached Lucan via Captain Lewis Nolan, who delivered it with contemptuous urgency. But Lucan, positioned in the valley, could not see the guns Raglan meant. The only guns visible to Lucan sat at the far end of the valley a mile distant, surrounded by Russian artillery on 3 sides. Lucan passed the order to Lord Cardigan, who commanded the Light Brigade. Cardigan protested the order appeared suicidal, but orders were orders. At 11:10 in the morning, the Light Brigade's 673 officers and men began their advance down the valley. Russian artillery enfiladed them from both sides. Ahead, more Russian guns waited. The Light Brigade charged into what Tennyson would call the Valley of Death. They rode with parade ground discipline through storms of shot and shell. Some reached the Russian guns, sabred the gunners, fought the cavalry beyond. But isolated, devastated, they had to retreat through the same killing ground. Of 673 who charged, around 260 were killed or wounded. 475 horses were lost. Campbell watched from his position with mingled horror and professional assessment. The Light Brigade's courage was beyond question. Their casualties proved it. But courage squandered through unclear orders, and command dysfunction was worse than useless. It was tragic. Campbell, who had spent his career husbanding his soldiers' lives whilst still achieving objectives, must have found the spectacle particularly bitter. The Battle of Balaclava ended in strategic stalemate. The Russians controlled the causeway heights. The British retained Balaclava, but the road between Balaclava and the siege lines now lay under Russian observation, making supply operations far more difficult during the approaching winter. Raglan declined to counterattack with his reinforcements when they arrived, fearing further losses. British casualties totaled around 615. Russian losses were similar, but the butcher's bill tells only part of the story. The charge of the Light Brigade captured imaginations because it embodied romantic military tragedy, brave men destroyed through command failure. The thin red line represented something less romantic, but more valuable: professional competence preventing disaster. Campbell's stand received praise from Raglan and the press. Russell's dispatch ensured the phrase, "thin red line," entered the language. But glory proved fleeting. Within weeks, other crises dominated attention. The siege of Sevastopol ground on through a terrible winter. Thousands died of disease and exposure in the trenches. logistics collapsed. The Light Brigade's sacrifice overshadowed the 93rd's discipline. Campbell continued to command the Highland Brigade through the remainder of the Crimean War. He led them at the Battle of the Great Redden in September 1855, though the assault failed with heavy casualties. When the Duke of Cambridge returned to England, Campbell took command of the 1st Division. He hoped for overall command when the war ended, but politics intervened. General Sir William Codrington received the appointment instead. Campbell returned to England in some bitterness, yet his reputation as a soldier's soldier, a careful commander who achieved objectives without unnecessary bloodshed, was established. When crisis erupted in India in 1857, Lord Palmerston knew exactly who to send. On the 11th July, 1857, whilst Campbell commanded Southeastern District in England, Lord Palmerston offered him command of all British forces in India. The Indian Mutiny, or First War of Independence, depending on one's perspective, had erupted across northern India. British garrisons were besieged. The strategic situation was chaotic. Campbell, aged 64, left England within a day. He reached Calcutta in August 1857 and immediately set about organizing a relief column for Lucknow, where British civilians and sepoys loyal to the East India Company were besieged in the Residency. Campbell's relief of Lucknow in November 1857 followed the tactical principles he had demonstrated at Balaclava: careful reconnaissance, concentrated force at decisive points, refusal to waste lives through impatience. He evacuated the Residency's defenders successfully, though the city remained in rebel hands. In December 1857, Campbell defeated Tantia Tope at the Second Battle of Cawnpore, then methodically recaptured Lucknow in March 1858. His campaign was characterized by thorough preparation and measured aggression, never rushing, never retreating, always advancing with adequate force and secure supply lines. The British government rewarded him with promotion to substantive general and elevation to the peerage as Baron Clyde in August 1858. The East India Company granted him an annuity of £2,000 annually. At 65, after 50 years of service, Colin Campbell finally received recognition commensurate with his abilities. But why had recognition come so late? The answer reveals much about Victorian military culture. Campbell lacked the social connections that smoothed advancement. He had no aristocratic family, no political patron, no inherited wealth. He could not purchase promotions. His methodical competence, whilst valued in crisis, lacked the romantic dash that captured public imagination. He was professional in an era that still venerated amateurism amongst officers. Moreover, Campbell's personality worked against him. Contemporaries described him as reserved, sometimes irascible, impatient with incompetence. He did not suffer fools. He criticized superiors when he believed they were wrong. Witness his resignation in India over Dalhousie's frontier policy. Such independence, whilst admirable, made enemies. The British military establishment preferred officers who accommodated themselves to the system. Campbell returned to England in June 1860. He was promoted to Field Marshal on the 9th November 1862. He died at Chatham on the 14th August 1863, aged 70. He never married, had no children. The barony became extinct with his death. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, an honor reserved for Britain's most distinguished figures. Statues were erected. One by Carlo Marochetti in Waterloo Place, London, in 1867. Another by John Foley in George Square, Glasgow, in 1868. For a time, Campbell's reputation stood high. Then the long forgetting began. Why has Colin Campbell's name faded whilst lesser commanders remain famous? Several factors contributed. Wellington and Nelson dominated the pantheon of Victorian military heroes. Their fame was unassailable. The charge of the Light Brigade, through Tennyson's poem, achieved cultural immortality. Campbell's methodical competence, whilst militarily superior, lacked poetic drama. The Indian Mutiny, where Campbell performed his greatest service, became increasingly uncomfortable for later generations. As the British Empire declined and perspectives on colonialism shifted, the heroes of imperial campaigns fell from favor. Campbell's methodical suppression of the mutiny, which involved harsh measures against rebels, sat uneasily with changing moral sensibilities. Moreover, Campbell left no memoir, no political legacy, no dynasty of officers carrying his name forward. He had no sons to perpetuate his reputation. His papers were not widely published. The meticulous archival work necessary to reconstruct his career occurred decades after his death, when public interest had moved elsewhere. Yet military historians recognize Campbell's significance. His tactical innovations at Balaclava, deploying an extended line to maximize firepower whilst trusting discipline to prevent cavalry breakthrough, anticipated later developments in infantry tactics. His careful logistics and attention to soldiers' welfare prefigured the professionalization of military leadership. His campaigns in India demonstrated that methodical preparation and tactical soundness could defeat numerically superior forces without sustaining unnecessary casualties. The phrase, "thin red line," entered military vocabulary as shorthand for disciplined infantry holding impossible positions through courage and training. It has been applied to British regiments in subsequent conflicts. The concept that well-trained troops with competent leadership can overcome seemingly hopeless odds remains a cornerstone of British military identity. Modern military analysis of Balaclava focuses increasingly on what went right: the 93rd's stand, the Heavy Brigade's charge, rather than solely on the Light Brigade's disaster. Campbell's decision to deploy in line rather than square is recognized as tactically brilliant rather than merely lucky. His later career as Commander-in-Chief in India demonstrates sustained excellence across the full spectrum of military operations: logistics, grand strategy, tactical command, and civil-military relations. The lessons Campbell embodied remain relevant. Military effectiveness depends more on professional competence than romantic glory, care for soldiers' welfare, and refusal to waste lives unnecessarily builds the trust essential for disciplined action under fire. Tactical innovation within disciplined frameworks. Campbell's line formation at Balaclava can overcome doctrine when circumstances demand, and personal courage must be combined with calculation. Bravery without judgment is merely fatal. On a low hillside above Balaclava, 500 men in red coats stood in two thin ranks and defied military orthodoxy. They did not form square. They did not retreat. They waited until Russian cavalry came within range, then fired two disciplined volleys that shattered the charge. Their commander, a 61-year-old Glaswegian who had spent 46 years learning his profession, had trusted them absolutely. They had justified that trust. The charge of the Light Brigade, which occurred hours later, claimed the glory. Tennyson's verses ensured its immortality. But glory and effectiveness are not synonymous. The Light Brigade demonstrated courage. The 93rd demonstrated competence. History remembers the former more readily, but armies depend on the latter. Colin Campbell died in 1863, honored in his lifetime but gradually forgotten. Thereafter, no schoolchild learns his name. Few can place the thin red line in context, yet his career embodies principles that remain vital: merit over privilege, professionalism over amateurism, calculated risk over reckless dash, care for subordinates over personal glory. Military history tends to celebrate dramatic failures: the Light Brigade, the Little Bighorn, Gallipoli, because tragedy makes better narrative than competent success. But the forgotten victories, achieved through professionalism and refused through stubbornness to accept unnecessary casualties, merit equal remembrance. Campbell's stand at Balaclava, his relief of Lucknow, His meticulous campaigns, these represent military virtue as surely as Thermopylae or Agincourt. The phrase survives him, the thin red line. It has been applied to police, firefighters, medical personnel, any small force, standing between order and chaos. The metaphor endures because it captures something essential: disciplined courage holding an impossible position through skill and solidarity. Perhaps that is sufficient legacy. The phrase outlived the man, carrying forward his principles even as his name faded. Every time infantry stands firm against superior numbers, every time discipline overcomes raw courage, every time a commander refuses to waste soldiers' lives, Colin Campbell's ghost stands with them. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders fired 2 volleys on a hillside in the Crimea. That brief action, lasting perhaps 5 minutes, demonstrated that well-trained infantry with competent leadership could defeat cavalry charges that should have overwhelmed them. The tactical lesson was absorbed by military establishments worldwide. The man who made it possible was gradually forgotten, but the lessons persist. And perhaps that is how Campbell would have preferred it. He was never one for glory. He wanted his soldiers to survive, his objectives to be achieved, his duty to be done. He accomplished all 3. The Victorian age produced more flamboyant commanders, more politically connected generals, more celebrated heroes. It produced few better soldiers than the carpenter's son from Glasgow who told his Highlanders, "There is no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." They didn't die. They stood, and that made all the difference.